Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Bridget Sladkey, our Executive Administrative Assistant. Welcome, Bridget.
Thank you.
It's great to have you on the show today.
I've been watching you do this show for almost a year now, and it's exciting to actually be on it.
Yeah, it's exciting to have you on the show today, too. And today we're going to be having a really fun episode talking about examples of positive masculinity in Lord of the Rings. And it's really important to uphold examples of men and masculine virtue in literature, especially in today's day and age, because there's been a concerted attack on masculinity and fatherhood in our culture for the past 60 plus years. And this is directly related to the breakdown of the family, the sexual revolution, and all the evils such as abortion flowing from that. So one way that we can help turn back the tide in our culture is by looking at examples of masculinity in literature and saying, what does a true man look like? What virtues does he have? How does he treat the people around him? And using that as a model for our behavior. What do we look for in men? What should we inspire boys to become? So, Bridget, what got you into Lord of the Rings originally? Because you know so much about Tolkien and all of his characters. I knew I had to interview you when we decided to do this episode. So, what got you into it?
Speaking of examples of masculinity, my dad's the one that got me into it.
Oh, that's really cool.
He found the books when he was a kid, absolutely fell in love with them, the world building, the language. He's a historian. So the in-depth history obviously really appealed to him. And so when I was a kid, honestly, one of my first memories is him reading The Hobbit out loud to me and my siblings. I remember one particular instance of us, I must have been like under 10 sitting there talking about the forging of the rings of power. And it's honestly one of my favorite memories from being a kid. By the time that the Lord of the Rings movies themselves came out, I remember asking him when he came back from the first movie if Frodo had thrown the ring in yet. So the ending was completely spoiled for me. I read the trilogy for the first time when I was about 9, I remember. Okay. And I've probably read it 6 or 7 times since then, at least. Yeah. Plus the Silmarillion and the entire history of Middle Earth. And
I was gonna say, you know a lot about his backstory and all of that too. Mm-hmm. Let's jump into that, because Tolkien didn't grow up with a father figure. So why do we trust his examples of masculinity? What gave him the ability to be able to write about men in a really great way without even growing up with a father?
Well, Tolkien's father died when he was 4. He didn't even really remember him very well. I think he maybe had 1 or 2 memories of his father. And his mom, he was born in South Africa, or what we would now call South Africa. His mother moved back to England specifically for his health. The temperature and the environment down there was really bad for him, and he kept getting sick. So he moved back. His father was supposed to follow. His dad died before he was ever able to come back to England and join the rest of the family. And so, yes, he did grow up without a biological father figure, but like many of his own characters who are orphans, he did have a strong male figure to look up to, namely a priest that his mother entrusted the guardianship of him and his brother Hilary to before she died. He lost his mother at a very young age as well, and that was Father Francis Xavier Morgan. Okay. Tolkien considered him a father. He called him Father Francis. I think there's a quote somewhere talking about just how huge the influence that Father Francis had on him as a person. Mm-hmm. And Tolkien, just as far as masculine traits, I mean, Tolkien is a scholar. Mm-hmm. But he also fought in World War I. He lived through 2 world wars, and he raised several sons of his own. So I would say that between that experience, he has a pretty deep understanding of, he saw, heroism in war. He saw the evils of war. He saw really good examples of masculinity across his very long life and across a really interesting time of history. I mean, he was born in 1892 and he died in 1973. So
wow, that's quite a span.
Yeah, the breadth of experience that he lived through. I mean, basically the end of the Victorian period all the way into the 70s is, he saw the beginning, not even the beginnings. He saw the destruction of what we would call traditional masculinity.
So it's really interesting that he would have seen the downfall of masculinity that way too. I didn't think about that when we were prepping for the podcast, that he would have grown up in a time frame where masculinity was valued and appreciated admired, and then by the 70s the sexual revolution had already happened, he would have seen it completely undermined, and he would have lived through the time of the Hollow Man too, which is the time in between the wars, World War One
Mhm.
and World War Two. How did that play into his work?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because Tolkien, a lot of the friends that he went to war with died. He
Wow.
lost a lot of friends in World War One, and many of the people that came back from World War One, like Tolkien, the poets and the scholars and the writers, frankly despaired. And they despaired in different ways. Some of them went with, nothing's worth in life, so let's just party. And some
Hmm.
of them went with nothing's worth in life, let's just wallow in our depression.
Was that like F. Scott Fitzgerald versus like T.S. Eliot, basically?
Yes, I would say those were actually the people I was thinking about. Great Gatsby
The
versus
Wasteland. Yeah.
yes. Whereas Tolkien, I think picked the healthiest route that you probably could at that time, and tried to find the light and the darkness. And I do think his Catholic faith and how strong of a faith he had played a lot into that. When everything in the world went dark, he had something to cling to. And
Mhm.
it comes across very, very strongly in his literature. It comes across very strongly in his characters, and in the difference between hope and despair.
So, why do you think that it's important for people to have examples of masculinity in literature to look at? Why do you think in today's day and age it's particularly important?
Well, for a start, the examples have just gotten
Worse.
exponentially worse. It is hard. I mean, you look at the books that are coming out, you look at the movies, whether they're written by men or women. The examples, what is being touted as masculine or as good traits in men, has just gotten horrifically bad.
Hmm.
The men tend to either have toxic versions of what people would see as stereotypical masculine traits,
Hmm.
or they're completely devoid of even what we'd call toxic versions of that. And they are just wimpy and effeminate. They've been drained of everything that would make them men.
I feel like they're either your toxic masculinity, your effeminate man, who's basically a man that has all the virtues of being like all feminine virtues and is probably looks kind of feminine, and
Mhm.
those are considered the pretty boys and kind of the idols of society and in the male sense in today's
Yeah.
society. Or they're like the bumbling sitcom father, where they don't really
Mhm.
have any kind of real relationship with their family.
It's beer and hot dogs and football.
Yeah.
So yes, you're either somebody who is been, and I say this hesitantly, hyper manly in the worst possible way, in the sense that they bring out the things that, the aggressiveness and the
What's
violence.
perceived as manly is violence and aggressiveness, not.
Yes, and maybe an overwhelming pursuit of tons of women, or all
Mhm.
of those
The
kinds of.
red pill men, basically, Andrew
Yes,
Tates of the world.
yes, yes. And so you either have that as an example, which obviously is appealing to nobody, and especially when that's perceived as a conservative value, because
Mhm.
those people would tout themselves as being red pilled and, right wing and all of that. Or you have, yes, the Harry Styles of the world, and then somewhere in between, yes, the bumbling dad who can't do anything right and is kind of like his daughters and his sons are embarrassed by him.
Just roll their
Um,
eyes, "Oh my gosh, dad." Dad
y-
jokes.
yeah.
Yeah, and not like dad jokes are bad, but that
Hmm.
there's been this sitcom father that's been going on in all sorts of TV shows for years where the dad is the laughing stock. He's the comic relief. He has absolutely no real masculine good qualities.
Or no authority.
Mhm.
It's the father of the family. He doesn't have any authority.
And so Tolkien's books can be a remedy to this because a lot of people know Lord of the Rings. They've either read the books or seen the movies.
Hmm.
And so when you have good examples of masculinity in those movies and books, then people have something to look up to. They have something to model themselves after. And even if a boy is growing up without a good father figure, he can look for examples of masculinity in literature. And a girl who might be growing up without a father or with a weak father can look at these examples and say, okay, I actually value this in a man. So it's super important that children and then even adults who maybe grew up without parent like a father figure have someone to look up to where they can recognize those qualities in a healthy, virtuous way.
Yes, and
And I
I would
think
say that yes, Tolkien obviously is doing that in his books. I mean, we see something similar with the Narnia books. That's
mhm.
still one of the more popular children's fantasy stories where we see healthy sibling relationship, healthy versions of masculinity and Edmund
I was gonna
and
say maybe
Peter.
not the healthy sibling relationship when Edmund betrays all his siblings, but other than that, it
Uh,
works out.
the obviously repenting of that and coming back from it is super important to sibling relationships. I have 7 siblings, and trust me, we do not always get along. But it's important, like, to again see that not just the good side of that, but when
Mhm.
things go bad, how do you come back from that? And
Yeah.
and we'll get into that with Tolkien's characters. They're not perfect, and where their flaws are, and how important it is to see examples not just of good masculinity, but of seeing good men who fail and then pick themselves up.
Mhm. Well, let's just jump right into that then. So I feel like the most obvious apparent one that everyone's going to have immediately come to mind when they hear masculinity in Lord of the Rings is Aragorn. So let's just, I don't want to say get the standard masculine traits out of the way, but let's just talk about how he embodies those because he's a really good example for that. He's a great leader, he's a great father figure. What traits of masculinity would a boy who's reading Lord of the Rings, what should he be looking up to in Aragorn? Or what should a girl who's reading this book see in Aragorn that is going to reflect a good man to her?
I mean, obviously, we talked about briefly the stereotypical things you mentioned: courage, leadership. Honestly, a huge part of him being a good leader is charisma, and not everybody has that. But it's good to see that embodied in a good leader, especially a fictional character, because in that
Mhm.
case, Tolkien can imbue him with any characteristic that he wants to. It's interesting to note that Aragorn himself is an orphan. And in fact has some similarities to Tolkien's own childhood in the sense that Aragorn loses his father at a very young age. He's 2, I think. Tolkien was 4.
Mhm.
His mother does live a bit longer than Tolkien's own mother did, but she also dies long before the Fellowship
Does
actually happens.
Does Tolkien give Aragorn a father figure that he looks up to and can
He
model
does.
himself after?
Elrond.
Okay.
Elrond is a actually I would say in some ways Aragorn has a lot of characteristics that are would make for a good father,
Mhm.
but since we don't really see him with any of his children, we know that he has a son and several daughters. But Tolkien doesn't actually show us what the family life is like. We can just extrapolate based off of the virtues that we do see in him.
Mhm.
But Elrond is a really good example of a father figure. Elrond, just for people who are less familiar with the lore, Elrond's brother is one of Aragorn's ancestors. And so Elrond sees his role as taking care of the descendants of his brother who
Mhm.
died. And so he goes out of his way. Aragorn is not the first of his brother's descendants that he's mentored and helped grow up, but he's the last in a long line. And I think the one that Elrond is the closest to. He really raises him as a foster son
Mhm.
in Rivendell. And in fact, Aragorn doesn't know who his real father is until he's 20. And Elrond's the one that tells him that and tells him of this great destiny that can lie before him, but that isn't assured. And that he's the heir to the reunited kingdom if he can reunite them.
So we have courage, we have leadership, we have charisma, and they're stereotypical for a reason. They're so important that men have something like that to look up to, and that's a
Mhm.
lot of the things that are lacking in today's society. Are there any like masculine traits about Aragorn that you are surprising?
I think one that comes to mind would definitely be, I mean, he is a scholar.
Mhm.
I mean, he's not as much of a scholar as you would see like Elrond himself,
Mhm.
or, maybe somebody like Faramir who is mentored by Gandalf. Um, Aragorn is definitely more of a wandering sword in some ways, especially early on in the story. But this is something that he gets from Elrond. I think one of the more surprising ones would be a healer, and I
Mm.
think that can be directly tied into a couple of things. Certainly, Tolkien has multiple characters that can be seen as Christ types. He doesn't have any one central figure. Like
Mhm.
there's no Aslan in Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
I mean there's a god, but there is no Christ figure as like Aslan. And I mean Christ the King, obviously Aragorn takes a lot of, you know traits, and there is some sort of mirror there.
Mhm.
Aragorn is meant to embody some of those same traits that we would see in Christ the King. But I think the healing is a really important one of those. It certainly comes from Aragorn's lineage, but the ability for him to fight to protect and then turn around and heal wounds, and not just heal physical wounds, but mental and spiritual wounds, I think is something you don't often see, especially in fantasy literature, as far as a trait that a warrior king would have.
And it makes sense when you think about masculinity tied in with fatherhood, because a father is going to be there to heal wounds, to help pick up the kids when they fall, or to be there. And he should be an emotional guide for his children as well. And when you realize that masculinity and fatherhood are so linked, like a good man is going to be a good father, or a good father is going to be a good man, and that they're not separate, they're
Mhm.
not opposed to each other, that totally makes sense that a good example of masculinity is also going to involve some type of healing
Mhm.
in some way,
And
shape, or form.
yeah, definitely. And you really see that. You see that on multiple occasions when he heals Frodo after he's first stabbed by the Morgul blade. He can't heal him completely, but he can at least stem the tide,
Mhm.
and keep him going until he meets up with Glorfindel and with Elrond himself, who is a master healer. But you also see that in his interactions with Faramir, Eowyn, and Pippin, who have all been brought low by the Nazguls, and they're all, specifically Eowyn and Mary, both helped destroy the Lord of the Nazgul, and just the mere fact of holding a weapon that helped kill him was enough to deeply injure them mentally
Mm.
and spiritually, and that obviously has very real physical effects in Tolkien's world. And Aragorn is able to call them back out of the darkness, is the way that it's literally described. And so it's interesting to see. There's a much quoted line: "The hands of the king are the hands of a healer,"
Mm.
and that's actually a symbol of his kingship, which is really interesting. And you can see that. I mean, obviously, there's something very beautiful and very noble about men that choose to become doctors and healers
Mhm.
in whatever way.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and it's not like I said, it's that's why I wanted to ask about a surprising one, because I feel like you think masculine, warrior king, example of masculinity in
Mhm.
Lord of the Rings, and Aragorn immediately comes to mind, and the fact that masculinity is so much more rounded, well-rounded than just good
Mhm.
leader looking out for the weak. It's all important, and I'm not saying that to negate those qualities in Aragorn, but I do think it's really beautiful to bring out those other, maybe gentler masculine traits that are there as well.
When you see them working together, you see Aragorn as a full person. He's not just, rah rah warrior king kind of thing. He also goes out of his way to learn his trade, as it were, both as a warrior and as a king.
Mhm.
You could call it almost an apprenticeship. When he's younger, he travels in disguise to Gondor, which is going to be the seat of his future power, and he doesn't tell anyone his name or his lineage. He enrolls as a soldier, and
Mhm.
he actually fights with Denethor, who later
Mhm.
becomes the steward of Gondor, as when they're both young men. And there's an immediate difference in how they're perceived. And actually, that's another place where we see Aragorn find a father figure in the old steward of Gondor, Ecthelion, which Denethor actually becomes a little bit jealous because he thinks his father is favoring Aragorn. Uh, Aragorn's just he's better at like spending time with his men. He doesn't hold himself aloof or above the people that he's working with. And then he after he finishes there, he goes to the land of the Rohirrim, and
Mhm.
he works there with actually Theoden's father. So that's he goes out of his way to learn the aspects of these different cultures
Mhm.
and the people that he will one day rule over. And I think it makes him a better man, and it makes him a better king.
There's a great humility there. That
Mm.
willingness to work side by side with the people who someday you'll be ruling and be able to really understand them so you can serve them well. And understanding, it seems like he understands that to be a good leader is to serve.
Yes. It's interesting that you mentioned that about Aragorn, because one thing that I noticed that was different in the movie and the books, it was one of the first things that popped out, is the reluctant king versus the, and in a good way, self confident leader who is ready to reclaim his birthright. And the movies tell the story of a reluctant king.
Mhm.
The books tell the story of somebody who has put in the time to learn what they will need for that role. He spent over, well, about 60 years learning and training and preparing. And he is ready by the time the fellowship leaves, he is ready to go claim his birthright. And the movies don't really go into that at all. They make it
Mhm.
look like he's weak and he's not really ready to claim that. And it's interesting as far as the different stories that you're telling there.
Mhm.
And there's something really beautiful, I think, about the confidence.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it seems like there is a virtue to the reluctant king. And there is in a way that you don't want people in power who want power because those people want it for the sake of being able to rule other people. You want someone who is humbled, who doesn't want to be given that role, and they're probably going to make a better leader in the long run. But on the other hand, I think there is a virtue to what you're saying about Aragorn, which is someone who recognizes that they have a duty, that they have people who are relying on them, that they have it's like the Joan of Arc quote, like I'm not afraid I was born to do this,
Yes,
where
it's
he was born to be a ruler and he recognizes the responsibility that comes with it and he rises to the task. And it's, I was born into this kingdom, which is different than how we look at people in power today. I was born into this kingdom. How can I become the best king possible for my people? And I'm going to step up into that role because this is what I was born into and I need to rise to the occasion to serve my people well.
and of course Tolkien is tapping into an older understanding of kingship
Hmm.
and I think a holier understanding of kingship and the responsibility that a king has to his people. It would honestly be cowardly for Aragorn to keep the humble life of the ranger, which in some ways might be easier than
Hmm.
stepping up and taking over the kingship and suddenly having all of these people that rely on him and whose care is entrusted to him and who he, you know, if he screws up, that's on him. And all of these people would suffer for any mistake that he makes. In some ways, it would be easier for him to stay in the shadows and protect from the shadows.
Hmm.
But it isn't what his people need, and it isn't what his duty is to them. And so again, you're looking at kingship in the best possible light, a king who
Hmm.
is a servant of the people who are underneath him.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay, so then the next one we are going to talk about was Faramir. And I think it was interesting because we were talking about these characters beforehand, and you were saying that Aragorn is a scholar, but he's also a fighter. And like the fighter is a little bit what gets emphasized there, and like the leader. Versus Faramir knows how to fight, but the scholar is more of what gets emphasized. So they both draw out these different qualities of masculinity and they both have both qualities. It's not that like being a good fighter is opposed to being a scholar or being a scholar is opposed to being a fighter, but that men need to have both. And then depending on personality, they might lean more into one and more into the other and how
Yes.
complementary there are. So what else would you say about Faramir?
Well,
I don't
and
know
I
if I
think
summarized that well either.
no, that's actually pretty good. They are both fighting scholars or they're both
Hmm.
they're both scholars and they both fight or warriors. A warrior scholar is probably a better way of putting that.
Okay.
But I do think that Faramir is much more of the academic, let's call him a steward for lack of a better term. That is
Hmm.
his act, that is the role that he takes on by the end of Lord of the Rings, where he has this isn't a perfect comparison, but let's throw in the idea of High King Peter from Narnia versus King Edmund.
Hmm.
Not that I mean, Aragorn obviously has very many elements of Edmund the Just. I mean,
Hmm.
he's making wise, just decisions as a leader. But Edmund is also a good example of a literary character who knows how to follow.
Hmm.
He's not. He's a leader and a follower, and I think this can be very misinterpreted. But I would say an interesting trait of Faramir's is that he's a good follower, which
That's, yeah, not something you normally hear about, and definitely not something you think of with masculinity. But I think it is so important that people recognize it comes down to humility, recognizing when you should listen to authority and follow authority versus when you need to step up and take the lead for those who you're supposed to be leading.
yes, definitely. And he's obviously primed to be a good follower in the sense that he's coming from a line of stewards who have
Hmm.
been holding on to the kingdom of Gondor, hoping that someday the king will return. And
Hmm.
we do see the difference in Faramir versus his father Denethor and his brother Boromir, and how they see that. Boromir, as a child, actually asks his father if how long it takes for a steward to become a king. And he's clearly, I mean, Boromir is overall not a bad person, but
And
there
we'll get into
is,
him in a few minutes. But yeah.
there's definitely a little bit more of a, urge there to rule. Whereas I think Faramir is, not everybody can be a leader. I mean, we all know that. Most people are going to have to follow. And so having a person who is good at following, and who is good at both following and leading, I mean, there has to be a hierarchy there.
Mhm.
Somebody's going to be on top.
It's a mixed bag.
Mhm.
There's going to be points in your life where you need to follow and points in your life where you need to lead, and having the prudence to be able to figure out which one is which and be able to do each of those well is so important. But like we were saying, it seems like people always focus on the leadership qualities of masculinity and not the need to also know when to follow.
And Faramir, he he's the captain of the Rangers, and he has been, by his position, he has been primed to be a good leader. And I'm certainly not saying that he isn't,
Mhm.
but I would say, generally speaking, he's not interested in fighting for the sake of fighting. There's an absolutely beautiful quote, where he says, "He loves not the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory, but only what they defend." And I
Yeah.
think that's really, really important to remember, as far as what are you fighting for? And Faramir never forgets that. Whereas I think at points, Denethor and definitely Boromir do forget that. And that can be a very easy thing, I think, to get caught up in the battle and forget about what you're fighting for.
I also, from what you were saying, it sounds like Faramir is one of those characters who didn't have a great father figure, but still was able to rise to the occasion, was able to overcome that, and is a great model for people who might be growing up either without a father or having a bad relationship with their father, to recognize that that doesn't need to weigh you down, that you can rise above that. How does he do that?
Well, it's Faramir's a very interesting character when it comes to that, because he has a living father.
Okay.
He has a living father who holds the highest position in the country, and a father who perhaps was kinder when he was younger before his wife died, um, and has become embittered and cold, and very much favors Faramir's older brother. And so, to both of the sons' credit, Faramir and Boromir, they still managed to have a really good relationship with each other, despite the fact that Boromir is the favored son and Faramir is the looked down upon son. They don't let that affect their own relationship. But I think part of the reason that Faramir is able to do that is because he actually has Gandalf as a father figure in some ways, to the extent where there is a point where Denethor, rather embittered and angry, actually basically complains that he's listening to the wizard over his own father,
Mm-hmm.
despite the fact that in many ways Gandalf has earned his loyalty as well,
Mm-hmm.
and has, especially, I would say, taught him compassion. A huge, huge trait in Faramir is his ability to show compassion, and also to know when to obey and when to disobey. I mean, obviously, we all know at this point. I mean, there's been some very obvious historical examples of how terrible it is to just be a good soldier and follow orders.
Yeah.
And in some ways, Boromir is more of the good soldier who follows orders, in the sense that when he gets the option to take the ring and bring it back to his father, that's what he does. And obviously, the ring would have twisted that, and we'll go more into that. Faramir is offered actually a much more benign, in some ways, version of that, and he manages to do what his brother couldn't.
And here's where you have to separate the movies from the books, if I understand you correctly. I've seen the movies way more recently than I've read the books. So can you explain how it's different in each one? Because I think that's very important.
Okay. Yes, that's actually a major complaint I have with the Lord of the Rings movies. They're fantastic movies in many ways, but they get Faramir wrong. Faramir in the movies is underconfident. They make him the good soldier who follows orders. Faramir in the books is much more his own man. He has an ability to think on his own and
Mhm.
to separate what I'm ordered to do with what I'm morally obligated to do, I would say. So in the movies,
Mhm.
when he comes upon Frodo and Sam in the forest of Ithilien, uh, he doesn't listen to them when they tell him about how they need to get to Mordor. He's really unwilling to do anything more than look at them at face value. And he's like, I'm going to obey orders. I'm taking you back to, he actually gets them all the way to Osgiliath. And he's going to take them to Minas Tirith, to be judged before his father. Whereas in the books, it's very clear that Gondor has a long-standing rule that it's a time of war. If somebody is found wandering in these forests, it's very much close to the outskirts of their territory. They are to be captured and brought back to Gondor. And if a soldier disobeys that, they're actually, liable to being executed for dereliction of duty. And Faramir is presented with this choice where he can obey the letter of the law there and bring them back to Minas Tirith, or he can let them go on and fulfill their quest. He gets to know them a little better. He sits down and talks with them, tries to gain an understanding. And that's another really big trait that Faramir is portrayed as having, is an understanding of people, and being a good judge of character, and being able to see very cleanly into what somebody's motives and purpose is. He quite accidentally finds out about the ring, and really he should be very tempted by it. He's not really originally a soldier. He's a soldier by necessity. It's not something that he seeks out. And so having the ring should give him an easy, quick path, both to his father's love, since his brother failed to bring it back at that point and has passed away, and an easy path to being able to put down the sword and, rebuild the city that he loves.
Targeted temptations.
Yes. And he comes through that with flying colors. He has enough character and enough wisdom to realize what the temptation is and completely bypass it in many ways. He does not drag them off, and then really putting his own life on the line as far as disobeying that rule, he lets them go. And it's important that he comes back. He could have, I suppose, just fudged a report, as we would say now, but he comes back and he reports to his father about what happened. And Denethor is going to, if anything, be harder on him because he's his son. He's not going to get any favors there. So he does disobey this long-standing rule, which ultimately allows the ring to be destroyed. But he also comes back and he doesn't hide from what he's done either. I think that's important, that he doesn't, fudge the report or lie or gloss over that.
He owns up to, takes responsibility for the action and said, I made this judgment call.
Yes.
Do with me what you will.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's go into Boromir, his brother. And Boromir's the one does not simply walk into Mordor character, correct?
Is the original meme. Yes, that's...
For anyone who may not know the stories. That's how I knew him for a while, so.
Yes, honestly, that was probably one of the first memes that I ever saw. Still very fond of it. He does not say that in the book.
Okay. But that's the character we're talking about?
It is.
Okay.
So yes, Boromir is bold. He's adventurous. He's a soldier through and through. He's a leader of men. He's the favored son. And in many ways, he's a good person. He loves his brother, even that would have been, honestly, when you think about sibling relationships where one kid is favored and the other one is constantly denigrated by their parent figure, most of the time they end up having a terrible relationship.
Who's older, by the way?
Boromir.
So he's the oldest son who's favored, and Faramir. He could very easily look down on his little brother.
And instead, he is really good to his little brother. And in many ways, I would say that Faramir also looks up a lot to Boromir, just going back to who he looks up to.
Yeah.
He's better than Boromir in many ways, but he certainly looks up to him, and he doesn't look, definitely doesn't look down on him character-wise. But yes, Boromir is, he's the warrior. He's the warrior archetype on many levels. And he rides all the way from Gondor to Rivendell to get an answer to a prophetic dream that his brother had. Denethor sends him as his emissary. He had the dream once, but really Faramir, he's going on the word of his brother. And you throw out the idea of like a prophetic dream as a reason to make a really long journey, half a world away, in Middle Earth terms. And that's pretty impressive. He's desperate to bring peace and desperate to protect his people. And that desperation drives him to Rivendell, to the Council of the Elves, which ordinarily, like, at this point in their history, the Gondorians have no interest in. Denethor has very little use for elves, or wizards, or anyone who's, perceived as kind of elvish. And that's honestly one of his complaints about Faramir.
Okay.
So he comes all the way to Rivendell only to find out, the answer to the riddle of his brother's dream, and end up in a position to help make peace a reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, as the son of the steward, he has a lot of other responsibilities, and it's really telling that. I mean, he is going back to Gondor. It's just a little more of a roundabout way, but it's really telling that he he doesn't volunteer. Actually, I should point that out. The Fellowship of the Ring volunteers in the movie. They are chosen in the book. The only people that volunteer are Frodo and Sam, and Merry and Pippin kind of force themselves onto the Fellowship by threatening to follow them anyways if they don't, let them come along. I think they threaten that they're going to escape and follow them unless, and I quote Pippin here, I think, they are sent back to the Shire tied up in a sack. It's the only way they're going to get rid of them. But Boromir is approached by Elrond, and he certainly agrees to come along and help. And he's very out of his element in many ways. Of the company of 9, only 2 of them are men. One is a wizard that Boromir has some passing acquaintance with. He's not super close to Gandalf, but he is a familiar figure. Mm-hmm. A elven prince who he knows nothing about, except that his people just lost Gollum, which isn't necessarily the greatest resume there. A dwarf, and Gimli, and the 4 hobbits. It's a very odd mix, and the fact that Boromir is willing to come along with them says a lot about. I mean, the Gondorians at this point are a little close-minded about the other races, I would say. So I think that speaks very well of him. And
what do you think stands out about him, though?
In many ways, Boromir is always going to be remembered for his flaws, because he is the one member of the Fellowship that falls to the temptation of the ring. And I think that's
what causes him to fall.
It's the desperation, I think, and overconfidence in his own abilities, and pride. Faramir is humble enough to realize that the ring will wield him and not he the ring.
Okay.
Boromir, in many ways, actually, I think also being the favorite son puts him in a bad position because he wants to bring the ring back to Denethor and make him proud. He's looking for a weapon. He wants an easy solution. He wants a quick fix to getting rid of Sauron forever, and the ring feels like that. And so it plays on that desperation.
In a sense, would you say he's never really learned to control? Well, I guess he has learned to control his passions because he's a good man in other ways, but it seems like there's a sense there where he isn't ready to play the long game. He just wants, like you said, the quick fix. He wants the solution too soon, even if it's not ethical.
I mean, he's been fighting for so long. It's very hard to look down on that. I mean, he's been fighting his entire life. He's grown up in the shadow of Mordor. Okay. So yes, it's a quick fix is like one way to put it. But certainly I think it's the pride that's the overwhelming issue there. The desire to make his father proud, even if it's not a good action that's going to make him proud, whereas Faramir's been able to separate more from what his father expects of him versus what he knows he should do. Whereas I don't think Boromir's been able to do that. And the ring plays on everyone's deepest fears and hopes. That's the way it works. And as Gandalf says, if he took the ring, it's going to offer him a way to better the world. But you can't better the world with evil. You can't use evil as a means to an end. And Boromir loses that part of the equation. And he's so desperate and so worried that he lets himself fall to it. Which brings us to, I think, the most defining part of Boromir is the fact that he falls and then he picks himself back up.
That's impressive.
And it's interesting because Denethor, his father, despairs later in the story and commits suicide. And I mean, suicide is not encouraged in this culture at all. But Denethor is a very proud man. He's, seeing the collapse of what he sees as everything that, that he's ever lived for or worked for, and his ancestors have worked for, and he gives into that.
Mhm.
Boromir, as somebody who is a good leader and has been in a position of authority from a young age and, has never really seriously misstepped, suddenly, like, at that point in his life, I think he's about 45, suddenly misstepping and failing just so badly. And I mean, repentance is a fine line there between falling into despair. I mean, we see that,
Mhm.
throughout history. We see it in the Bible with Judas. I mean, he really, truly, repents of having turned to Christ in after he sees just how badly wrong it went.
Mhm.
But being able to not despair at that point, I think, is so important to Boromir. And it's important as somebody who has always been, I think, a very masculine man.
I think that
His,
is a really good thing for boys and men and girls even to be able to see is that like someone who has been working, who has been trying, who is a good person and who has been trying their whole life and hasn't really failed to then fall that drastically and to still be able to pick yourself up and keep going. Like in some ways, like falling down 2 or 3 stairs when you're already struggling to walk isn't as big of a deal as someone who's like climbed all the way up and then falls all the way back down and has to start over again. And I think the fact that he doesn't despair in that case is so impressive and such a good thing for people to be able to see and see modeled for them.
yeah, definitely. I mean, it's so important. I mean, how many characters do you see in stories where they fall and they come back?
Edmund.
Edmund, yes.
But other than that,
I
yeah,
mean, there's a hefty dose of
leave
Aslan
it
in
to
there, whereas,
Lewis and Tolkien both to have the character who falls that bad and gets back up.
but
But
even there, Edmund is a kid who
mhm.
isn't fully understand what he has just agreed to. He offers to bring his brothers and sisters to the witch.
But he thinks the witch is good in a
Yes,
sense.
he's a distorted. He's already been like his mind has already been corrupted
Mhm.
by what he's eaten and like her influence over him. He's not actively bringing them to be killed.
Mhm.
He's bringing them to be more powerful than them
To
and
get
kind
magic
of
candy to eat forever.
well, and to kind of see Peter get like some comeuppance and stuff like
Yeah.
that. He's not turning them over to be killed. Boromir actively chases Frodo with intent to kill,
Mm.
in trying to take the ring from him. And so being able to come back from that and turn around and defend the other hobbits and die doing that is really, really impressive.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, like, I mean, I'm not saying that any of Tolkien's friends had similar situations, but I do think there's a realism to war and failure that Tolkien brings to his books that even fantasy stories that pride themselves on being grittier than
Mhm.
Lord of the Rings lose. I mean, you get a real sense that war is necessary sometimes, that it can it's it can be a defense, and it's necessary, and men should be willing to fight,
But
um
it's to protect those ones at home, like you said from the quote from
and that
Faramir,
it's
where
not a
it's not for
beautiful
the sake.
thing. It's not this glorious like Viking fever dream. And I think a lot of media can sometimes portray war as
As a
almost a good thing.
yeah, as a means to glory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Tolkien, I think, is very good about reminding us that it is a product of a fallen world.
Mhm. Okay, so the next ones we were gonna talk about were Legolas and Gimli. But before we get there, we have to address the effeminate elves. They're in the movie. Why is Legolas even an example of masculinity? And how can he be when his hair is perfect and he looks like a stick?
Well, let's talk about how the movies got the elves wrong on basically every level.
Okay.
Um, yes, there's a lot of things the Lord of the Rings movies did right. I think fundamentally the people who were making the movies do not get Tolkien's elves.
Okay.
One of the reasons Tolkien wrote the elves was wrote the elves the way they were, and he was actually there were times when he went back and forth on whether or not he should have even used the term elves, because it's tied up with so many other
Ah.
things, and kind of like diminutive fairy folk kind of um, connotations there,
Mhm.
and so he went back and forth on that. But when Tolkien was picturing elves, he's picturing basically I guess an English version of demigods. Like think
Okay.
about the kind of people that you see in Greek mythology, Jason and Perseus, and like, I mean, those are the kind of like supernaturally long-lived, you know, extremely strong
Mhm.
people that he's picturing for the elves. They're warlike. Yes, there's a good deal of Tolkien basis for the long hair, but no, probably not the L'Oreal commercial long hair that we get in the movies. And actually, some people asked him about Legolas, and the I mean, certainly about the fact that he could be perceived as effeminate. And there's a great quote from him, which I will actually read it in its entirety because it's fantastic. Talking about Legolas, he says that he was as tall as a young tree, lithe and immensely strong, able to swiftly draw a great war bow and shoot down a Nazgul, endowed with the tremendous vitality of elvish bodies, so hard and resistant to hurt that he went only in light shoes over rock and through snow, and that he was the most tireless of all the fellowship. So even compared to Aragorn, who is a consummate warrior, I
Mhm.
mean, there's points during the trip that they make across Rohan where Legolas is like totally willing to still be going on, and Gimli and Aragorn are like, we need to stop and get some sleep here.
Yeah.
Um, so just to be clear, the Legolas that you're seeing in the movies is not the Legolas that you're seeing in the books.
Mhm. Or the
Um,
elves in general.
yes, they're very aloof. Tolkien's elves can be aloof, but there's in many ways they're kind of schizophrenic as far as like how they perceive the world. Like one minute they'll be basically a carefree child, and the next minute they'll be like a stern warrior.
Okay.
And they're able to reconcile that, and they're really fascinating. As far as I don't think I've ever seen any fictional race that quite is like the elves. There's been a lot of poorer imitations, but
Mhm.
nothing that's quite as fascinating as, I mean, the elves are my personal favorite. I'll
Okay.
just be honest. Book Legolas is not effeminate.
Okay.
Long hair and all. I mean, Glorfindel, who is elf that you're the first high elf that you're introduced to
Mhm.
in the Fellowship, who shows up on his horse at the point where the movie substituted Arwen. And I mean, the Nazgul, all 9 of them are freaked out by him. He's that impressive both physically and spiritually. And there
Okay.
is a hefty spiritual element, certainly to somebody like Glorfindel. Yes, he has long golden hair that he doesn't tie up, which is a funny story in its own right because he once accidentally fell off a cliff because he didn't tie up his hair and a Balrog pulled him down. But I
You
digress.
digress.
Yes, very much so. Going back to Legolas, I think it's hard to talk about Legolas and Gimli without each other because their friendship is such a huge part of Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
And it's such an important part as far as who they are at the start of the book and who they finish as.
And I think just in general, talking about masculinity and examples of masculinity for boys and adults and boys and men, I think that male friendship, it's people don't recognize that in today's day and age anymore, and it's so important for men to have good male friends. And when we had Dr. Fagan on the podcast, he was talking about the need for men to have good friends. And I think that that's why their friendship is so important to talk about in this episode, is that men need examples of friendship in literature to be able to see modeled for them what they could have in real
Mhm.
life.
And they're friends. They're not just. I mean, they are friends in battle, but they're
Mhm.
not just friends in battle. And I think the movie leans heavily on the brothers in arms aspect of Gimli
Mhm.
and Legolas's friendship, which is not a bad part of that friendship, but it's a lot deeper than just the brothers in arms.
Mhm.
I mean, we come from this background. There is an ongoing feud between elves and dwarves. There's some very, very old and bitter history there. So the initial meeting there is not very positive.
Okay.
And in fact, there's points during the early part of the Fellowship where Legolas and Gimli are sniping at each other so much that Gandalf has to be like, please, would the two of you at least try and get along? I mean, it's obnoxious enough that it's actually causing issues.
Yeah.
And you get the sense that they are both getting along with the other members of the Fellowship. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't necessarily see Boromir and Legolas having deep conversations, but the rest of them are all getting along. I mean, they're maybe not like super close friends yet, but you can only travel so long with a group of people without getting to know them fairly well. But by the time they get to Moria, there's a lot of enmity and pent up tension there that's bubbling over into active hostility,
I
I
was
would
gonna
say.
say, do you think that that is a moral failing on the part of both Legolas and Gimli that they are being aggressive to the other person, or do you think it's an example of two virtuous people whose personalities don't jive?
I think it's a combination.
Okay.
I do think there is. I mean, obviously they've both been raised a certain way, and so they would have to go against that
Hmm.
conditioning to see the other person as, somebody who is at least a possible friend, instead of an enemy. I mean, they have been raised to see each other as, I mean, at very least an adversary, if not an enemy.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to say that's entirely a moral failing. And I do think they're both good people
But even
even
that
before that.
is still a prejudice that is still a moral failing in a sense because you're not seeing the worth of the other person.
Yes, I'm just saying it's not entirely their fault.
Okay,
But
that's fair.
I do think it raises to the level of a moral failing they both overcome by the end of the story,
Hmm.
and it makes them both better people, which is the whole point of a journey,
Hmm.
like the one that is portrayed in Lord of the Rings. So after Moria, they do obviously fight together in Moria. And after Gandalf falls and they come to Lothlorien, you see a friendship that everyone is frankly very surprised about blossom. And I think a huge part of that is probably the influence of Moria. Moria obviously was a stronghold of the dwarves. Legolas gets to see Gimli in his element when he's very out of his element.
Hmm.
Gimli then sees Legolas in Lothlorien in his element where he's very out of it.
What do you think about their friendship is really important for men to see?
I think it's really important to see like that difference and to see the differences and see how they bring out the best in each other. Once they become friends,
Hmm.
they both are able, and I heard this recently in a talk about friendship. The priest who was giving the talk was talking about how if you have a group of three people, let's say three guys,
Hmm.
um, and Adam, John, and Ben all have certain characteristics, and when Ben and Adam hang out, they're going to have certain things that they bring out in each other that
Hmm.
are good, and when Adam and John hang out, there's going to be certain things that they bring out that are good, and the same with the third there. And if you lose one of those people, you're not just losing that person, but you're also losing all of the good that they bring out in the other
Hmm.
two. And those two that are left bereft of the parts of themselves that only came out when that third
Hmm.
person was there. And that's getting a little convoluted, but I think it's important to look at how Gimli and Legolas interact later on. They're
Hmm.
both they're both nature lovers, I guess you could say, to put it very, very baldly. And they both appreciate the natural world, but they appreciate different aspects of it.
Hmm.
As a dwarf, Gimli is drawn to stone and stonework and carving, and the underground and caves, and there's a wild sense of natural beauty there,
Hmm.
and a sense of shaping it and ordering it and bringing beauty to that. Solidity and strength, and stone and metal work and that kind of stuff. Legolas as an elf obviously is drawn to much more untamed nature and growing things and plants and all of that. And so you actually see them bringing the best out in each other when Legolas convinces Gimli to come into the forest with him and to appreciate trees that he would otherwise see as just useful for building a fire, as these, and Tolkien obviously had a huge love for trees, so that's so important to have a dwarf that looks at trees and sees them as things of beauty,
Yeah.
and doesn't want to pull them down. I mean, the worst thing you could possibly do, I think, in Tolkien's mind, was cut down trees. And then Legolas, in return, agrees to go into caves. Legolas is not a fan of caves. He's really not at his best the entire time in the Moria because he can't see in the dark as well as he can in the light, and so there's like a claustrophobia there, and being
Hmm.
underground, it's very much against everything that he likes.
Hmm.
And he sees stone as something that's dead and gone. And it's interesting because there's a line where he's when they're outside Moria where he says the stones, he can kind of hear the stones, but not the way that he can hear the trees. I mean, elves have this huge connection with nature.
Mhm.
And Gimli's able to make him appreciate that and show him the beauty of the glittering caves of Aglarond, which is where he takes him. And
So they're both kind of drawing out a new love in the other person for something they wouldn't have appreciated otherwise. Like my
mhm.
like your love for something would draw out my appreciation of it, even if it's something I wouldn't naturally like on my own.
Yes, and obviously there's other examples of that. That's I think one of the most obvious ones.
Hmm.
But it's a friendship that goes deeper than just battlefield banter,
Okay.
which is a lot of what you get. And Legolas is not aloof. I think that's a huge issue with the way he's portrayed in the movies. He's an aloof quipster. He
Hmm.
just says he's the Alto of the Fellowship. Okay, so when I was in choir, the alto part of any piece usually was the part that filled in the gaps that were left by the other three voice parts.
Okay. That makes
So,
sense.
your sopranos sing your melody, your tenors and your bass are, filling in the guys' parts of that, and then the alto fills in all the gaps. So you usually end up with really odd combinations of notes.
Hmm.
But Legolas in the movie, he kind of does that. He'll, like, when you need something obvious said, or a little bit of exposition, or just like a random comment to fill in the silence,
Or some nice hair.
or that you throw Legolas in to state the obvious. Whereas Legolas is much more approachable. In some ways, he's more like the Hobbits, I would
Hmm.
say, than like somebody like you can almost relate to them better than somebody like Boromir can.
Okay. So we had Legolas and Gimli and their friendship and how they both draw out the best in each other and how that's a really great model for being able to overcome prejudices that are sometimes there versus either personality or just how you're growing up thinking, perceiving other people, how they overcome that and have this really strong friendship because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think the last main characters left are the hobbits.
Yeah, I mean, we're going through the Fellowship. We should probably throw some Gandalf in
Oh,
there
that's true too.
as
Yeah.
well. But yes, the Hobbits. I am going to gloss over them a little bit more. Just as far as like we see a lot of the same traits in them.
Yeah, we don't have to go through each one necessarily, going into each one in depth individually, but hobbits as a whole, and then specific ones that the others spring out.
I mean, the hobbits are your everyman characters.
Okay.
They're the untried people. I mean, everyone else has already had contact with evil, and
Hmm.
like the kind of evil that you get, fighting orcs and Nazgul, and there's the hobbits. I mean, yes, I'm not saying like Hobbiton is not entirely idyllic, but the kind of like petty evil that you're dealing with is like Lobelia Sackville Baggins stealing your silver spoons and not returning them. It's, a hobbit girl that spends too much time looking in the mirror and admiring her curls, which Bilbo does actually write a response to something something like that at one point.
Would you say that like the other characters in the fellowship show like virtue that's already been practiced and the habit has already been formed and it's showing more of the excellence of virtue versus the hobbits kind of show the raw material of like they haven't really developed the virtue yet because they haven't encountered a chance to have to build it?
I mean, I would certainly say that in the Fellowship, the hobbits, I suppose, very broadly, you could say they are the young men or the boys, the adolescents who grow into men.
Okay.
Whereas, I mean, Aragorn's already spent 60 plus years walking around Middle Earth fighting evil. I mean,
Hmm.
Legolas, we don't know how old he is. He's the son of the Elven King. He lives in Mirkwood. He's been fighting this probably as long as he's been alive. We know Boromir has. I
Hmm.
mean, Gandalf is basically a version of Saint Michael. In many ways, he's not an angel. That's in actually we'll get to that when we talk about Gandalf. He can fall, but he's obviously far beyond the rest of them in terms of how long he's been fighting
Hmm.
evil and been growing and maturing. I mean, he's thousands of years older than anyone else.
Hmm.
Well, he's been before the dawn of the world. Um, yeah, the other characters, we talked about Boromir.
Hmm.
Gimli obviously is dwarves live longer than men. He's
Hmm.
been fighting for a long time, but yeah, I the hobbits are being pulled out of their comfort zone. And it's really impressive because most hobbits have no desire to leave their comfy surroundings. And Frodo obviously has grown up listening to Bilbo. Frodo's another character that doesn't really have, he doesn't have a biological father figure.
Okay.
Both of his parents die in a boating accident, which shows you how unusual they are, because most hobbits stay as far away from rivers as possible. And his parents drowning was a big deal, and it made people even more inclined to stay away from messing about on boats, as Sam, I think, puts it. But Frodo grows up with Bilbo as his father figure, and Gandalf obviously makes an appearance as well. So he's growing up hearing tales of Bilbo's adventures, and obviously that's interesting to him. I think of all of the, obviously Faramir is not part of the Fellowship, but of all of the people we've talked about, Faramir is probably the one that's most like Frodo in some ways. They both have a scholarly aspect.
Okay.
Both of them are not really interested in. Both of them would honestly probably rather have their nose in a book than be out fighting a battle.
Okay.
But both of them rise to the challenges that they are given, and they do the best with what they are given. And Frodo, I think, obviously, the defining characteristic is going to be the self-sacrifice and the perseverance. Frodo, I mean, hobbits are more immune to the ring, but it does take a toll on them. Frodo is incredibly strong-willed. I don't think there's anyone else, maybe not even Sam, that could have carried the ring as long and as far as Frodo did. And it takes an incredible toll on him. There's saints that describe the dark night of the soul, and in some ways what Tolkien describes Frodo by the end of the journey sounds similar to that. I mean, he's talking about how there's just nothing. It's his mind and his body and his soul. It's just arid. And all he has is, I mean, hope and friendship and his, strength of will. And I think that really people lose out on that aspect, especially when it comes to Sam. Sam is incredibly loyal. Sam is totally not tempted by the ring. The best temptation the ring can muster for Sam is the entire world being a garden. And that's really appealing to Sam. And he promptly puts it aside in under, 30 seconds. He's not interested in that. And I mean, even though that's what would be most appealing to him, Frodo of all the hobbits could probably become more powerful, the most powerful if any of the hobbits fell to the power of the ring. And I mean, he certainly would never come close to somebody like Gandalf or Elrond falling to the power of the ring. But it's a testament to his strength of will. He's not especially imposing. He is smaller than almost anyone else on his team except for the other hobbits. And it doesn't matter because he has the courage and the, again, strength of will to push through all of that.
Perseverance.
It's such a huge part of his character. And Tolkien really emphasizes that. Frodo doesn't throw the ring into Mount Doom. He can't. By that point, he's just carried the ring too long. But he does, and Tolkien emphasized this, he does everything humanly possible to get to the ring to where it needed to be. And yes, he's saved by Gollum ex machina, to be, very facetious about it. But ultimately, Gollum being there doesn't matter if Frodo hadn't had the will and the courage to push through absolutely horrifying odds. I have a hard time reading the Dead Marshes and the parts where Sam and Frodo are trekking through Mordor because Tolkien is able to describe so vividly how dry and uninhabitable and utterly lifeless what they are going through.
It's funny because you don't necessarily think of the hobbits as the masculine characters of the book, but that ability to keep going through something so
dogged
hard.
Perseverance.
Exactly. It's that is such a good trait for men to be able to have, and women too. But again,
but it is more associated with guys.
Yeah, and it's just I love how you've been able to kind of tease out these masculine traits from characters that aren't always on the surface level what you think of when you think masculinity in Lord of the Rings. You immediately think maybe Legolas, definitely Aragorn, maybe Boromir, but being able to bring it out of the hobbits is so important to be able to show that they also have these virtues that men need to be able to imitate and see.
Well, and Merry and Pippin, I think Merry and Pippin often get lumped together.
Mhm.
Merry and Pippin are not the same person at all. I mean, people really do confuse them. Um, again, problem with the movies. But Mary's older than Pippin. Mary actually, I think, probably has more in common with Frodo than Sam has with Frodo.
Interesting. Why?
Mary is a planner. Mary's the
Okay.
one that reads maps. Mary wants to know where he's going. Mary is the one that orchestrates the hobbits going with Frodo and Sam.
Mhm.
Like, he's the one that he finds out about the ring before Frodo finds out about the ring, because he saw Bilbo use it and he just kept mum about it and like snuck around and spied it out. So he's the one that, really, I mean, Pippin obviously is going to go along with it, but he's the one that figures out what's going on and that Frodo is leaving.
Mhm.
And he's loyal. I mean, we see the fact that he goes from being clever and enterprising and brave and intelligent at the beginning of the Fellowship to one of the killers of the Witch King of Angmar. I mean, you Mary from the beginning of the Fellowship, it shows just how much he's grown. I
Mhm.
mean, he was already an impressive hobbit. Just how much he's grown that by the end he can stand on his own 2 feet. I mean, just the kind of sheer moral fortitude that it would take to stab that Witch King. I mean, most people, and it's emphasized over and over again, hearing him from thousands of feet in the air scares people and sends people cowering in fear.
How do you
Like,
think he developed that moral fortitude?
I mean, it's the same way that anyone develops moral fortitude, by overcoming smaller trials and exercising their, I mean, virtue, the muscles of your virtues is probably the best way of
Yeah,
putting
building
that.
your virtue muscle. Yeah.
It doesn't happen overnight. It takes smaller trials that you overcome and you persevere through. And the same thing happens to Pippin.
Mhm.
I mean, Pippin is adorable in some ways, and he's clever and smart and a little bit of a goof off, and he's technically still like the Hobbit version of a teenager when the Fellowship starts. And by the end, he manages to kill like a troll at the battle before the Black Gate. Again, trolls are twisted ends. Pippin is like maybe 3'2", or I mean, actually by that point he's drunk the waters of the Entwash and it's made him taller. So he maybe is 3'5" or 6. And by the end, I think it's really interesting the way that Merry and Pippin are described after they come back.
Mhm.
They're the merry knights of the Fellowship by the end. They're both, Pippin's a knight of Gondor, Merry's a knight of Rohan, and they come back and they fit all of the best parts of like this medieval idea of chivalry. You
Mhm.
know, they're taller than the other hobbits, which is hilarious. But they're merry and happy and joyful, and you see that radiate out. They're confident. I mean, after the scouring of the Shire, they're defenders of people who can't defend themselves, and it's really cool. I mean, they sound like something out of like a Hobbit Arthurian legend, kind of. And of course, we want to look at Sam. Obviously, his defining trait is loyalty.
Mhm.
I mean, it doesn't take a very long read. He is incredibly loyal,
Mhm.
but he's also he's really good at teasing out hope, I think. I mean, and there's a fantastic line when Frodo and Sam are in Mordor. Everything, as I said, is it's dry, it's lifeless, it's utterly demoralizing.
Mhm.
And there's at that point there's dark clouds that have veiled most of the sky. The stars, you can't see the stars through. There is one star that gets through. And Sam is also surprisingly poetic. I mean, because he is kind of your everyman.
Mhm.
He's you know farmer.
Yeah.
Um, and he's lying back there looking up at the sky, and he brings up this whole idea of the fact that he and Frodo are just a small part of this larger story, and an
Mhm.
ongoing story. And even if at this point Sauron wins and they fail, there's still, he puts it, light and high beauty forever beyond the reach of evil. And there's something like so beautiful about that, and being able to tease out that hope and that light in the midst of darkness. I mean, he's so The hobbits are so tiny. They're ants compared to this like huge machinery of Sauron's war. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of orcs marching around them. This
Mhm.
entire land, this looming magical volcano. I mean, I think it's very hard to describe just how insignificant they are compared to all of that,
Mhm.
and how hard it is not to be just overwhelmed by the sheer might of evil. And we see
Mhm.
characters that Tolkien paints out. Saruman, who is wise and clever and intelligent in his own right. He's also very prideful. He
Mhm.
starts off as a good character.
Mhm.
I mean, by the time we meet him in the Fellowship, he's gone bad. But as an actual person, but he sees himself as very significant. He needs to make his mark on the world,
Mhm.
and he needs to find things out, even if it means breaking them. And he gets overawed by the sheer show of strength that Sauron has, and it destroys him. And he would rather be powerful than be good. Um,
Versus the hobbits are so humble
and they're
and
so
so
small and they're so insignificant in some ways, and yet what their core virtues and their strengths make up for all of that.
they're like the
Yes.
mustard seed
Mm-hmm.
comparison in like the gospels of like if you ever see a mustard seed from Israel, they're so incredibly tiny. They're
Oh
not
yeah.
your Dijon mustard seed that you see in the store.
Mm-hmm.
They're like a speck of dust.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I guess what the hobbits were like in the grand scheme of this
Mm-hmm.
whole world.
But it's also just important, I think. The hobbits, you see people that are they're aware that they're small and insignificant, and it doesn't matter because they're still willing to do what needs to be done.
Mhm.
They're loyal to each other, and yes, they're kind of a little bit lost. I mean, they're a little overawed. I, no one
Mhm.
has half the time. No one has ever met a hobbit. They call them halflings. They basically look like children, but they are adults, especially by the end of the story,
Mhm.
and they've really grown up and become men. Before we finish, I do want to talk about Gandalf
Okay.
because he's the link that ties the Fellowship together.
Mhm.
He's even a link between Frodo and Sam and Faramir, actually,
Okay.
because he's the one person that they've all met at some point or another, and he's had an influence on all of their lives.
Mhm.
Um, and Gandalf has a long and complicated backstory. You don't see much of it in Lord of the Rings. You see glimpses of it,
Mhm.
but he belongs to a race of, easiest way to say it is angelic beings,
Mhm.
but they're not angels, and I think people get confused about that. Angels made their choice. Some
Mhm.
of them fell, some of them didn't, and by nature an angel can't
Change
change.
now.
They've
Yeah.
made up their mind. It's like a human at the like when they die, that's it. You've either chosen, you've made like a final repentance
Mhm.
and you want to spend eternity with God, or you haven't and you've chosen hell.
Mhm.
And Maya, the race that Gandalf belongs to, are not like that. Sauron was a Maya. Sauron actually repented at one point and then failed in his repentance. Saruman could have repented but didn't, and certainly was good at the start of his career as a wizard. Gandalf has so many opportunities to fall. He has temptation after temptation with the ring, um, which is obviously why he sees a core of strength in the hobbits that a lot of other people don't, because
Mhm.
they're small, and he's humble enough to admit that they can do something that he can't. I mean, this is like
That's really important for
this
people
is
to
like Saint
realize.
Michael looking at a human and being like, "Wow, they can do something that I can't. I'm immortal and so much more powerful than they can imagine." Like, humans can't even really look at angels without falling down in fear. I mean, you read the Bible and
Mhm.
angels in their like even like human form, when
Mhm.
they take it, are incredibly terrifying, with how much power they have. And for Gandalf to look at the hobbits and be able to admit that about himself is amazing. We also a key trait of Gandalf's is the compassion, and he comes off as a little crotchety in the movies.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
associate compassion with Gandalf from the little bit I know of him.
But if you remember, Bilbo and Frodo both learn a lot from Gandalf, and there's a point where when he's going through the history of the ring with Frodo, and he talks about Gollum. Frodo points out that it was a pity that Bilbo didn't just kill Gollum when he had the chance. I mean, because he's a pitiful, evil, warped creature. And Gandalf says, "Pity. It was pity that stayed his hand." And even Gandalf is willing to give Gollum a second chance. I mean, he brings him to the Wood Elves, who are also willing to kind of rehabilitate him. But Gandalf is defined by not false compassion. I mean, because there is false compassion. But Gandalf is offering sincere compassion. And obviously he's dead by the time that Boromir falls. But I think it's telling that Aragorn, who is one of Gandalf's pupils, in a very real way. I mean, he's also mentored by Gandalf, is willing to give Boromir, he's still willing to kind of work with Boromir even after Boromir falls. And he actually, it's a fascinating trait where you actually see like a trait passed down between mentor and mentee. Yeah. But Gandalf, he offers compassion to Saruman, like true compassion, where Saruman needs to repent and help. And Saruman is so prideful at that point that he can't stand the thought of being offered forgiveness. Like he honestly, it kind of comes back to.
What do you mean he offers true compassion?
I mean, not like a false compassion, and not like,
not like an affirmation of what he's doing. Or
yes.
Like, I get it. I get what you're going through.
Yes.
Let me help you.
No, Saruman would certainly need to repent, and he would need to do the hard work of, dealing with everything that he's done wrong. And if he's willing to do that, I mean, Gandalf would work with him.
Would you say Gandalf is a good example of being able to like hold people accountable and call them to task, but at the same time extend forgiveness if they actually repent, in a sense?
I would. And the ring that he carries, the Ring of Fire, is supposed to help ignite a fire in the hearts of people. It doesn't necessarily give the chief power of the ring that Gandalf wears is to help bring courage to the hearts of the people around them.
Interesting.
Which is like a fascinating trait for a character like that.
He is with the Fellowship. Yeah, because I feel like in today's world, a lot of times people misunderstand compassion. Like you see that we like with euthanasia, like, oh, it's a false compassion. Like we're gonna help you through your suffering. Like it's okay, not help you through the suffering. We're gonna end the suffering by killing you. And I feel like it's really important for people to have examples in literature of characters who have extended true compassion, which is calling people to task, helping them through those really tough times without ending it immorally.
And it doesn't always work. There is a very, very prominent example of Gandalf offering compassion to Denethor. Gandalf stops him from killing Faramir and tries to get him to go attend to the duties that he has. And Denethor, he just can't. At that point, he's given into despair. And so even after Gandalf holds out a hand, even after that kind of horrific thing where he's like planning on killing his son, and he turns around and he would rather die than face that kind of ruin. And in doing so, he completely misses out on the fact that the black ships that are coming actually have allies. Like he only sees what he thinks is happening, and he completely loses his hope. And he dies for that. And he dies. He can't take that compassion at that point, I think, and it's really sad. But it's really cool that Gandalf still offers it. Gandalf is also very much associated with animals. We see him with Shadowfax, who no one else can tame or work with. There's something very telling about somebody, women as well as men, but especially with a guy that. I'm not saying you can't ever like shoot an animal or hunt or anything like that, but there's something very telling about being gentle with something that is someone or something that is below you, especially how you treat animals. Like needless cruelty is always a red flag. And we certainly see that with some of the characters in Tolkien and how they treat people below them and animals. There's just like the petty cruelties
isn't good.
No.
Yeah.
But anyways,
I think we just exhausted the whole list of like all of the main characters.
oh, trust me, there are a lot more Tolkien
I said
characters.
main characters.
Oh, I mean, if we wanted to dive into the Silmarillion, there's plenty of main characters there. But I think we'll leave that
I think
for
people
another.
familiar with the movies and somewhat the books are going to know most of these names. So I knew
Yes.
all of them except for Faramir when we first started talking about this. So that
You
speaks
could-
a lot.
You didn't
I didn't know that
remember
much about.
you didn't remember who Denethor was. You called him
That's true.
You called him Denimore.
Yeah. Well,
Makes him sound like a pair of jeans.
Anyway, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Bridget.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And to all of our listeners, please like, subscribe, check out the new ebooks we have coming out, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.